Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer 40k lore. I'm getting over a really nasty sore throat this week, so I hope you'll excuse me if we do a briefer topic today. One of the Tau's subject species, and probably the single most important of them all, the Nicassar. Or as they are often alternatively referred to as, the flying pancake bears. And I must admit, I do have a certain fondness for the flying pancake bears. Tragically, Games Workshop has changed their description somewhat since the invention of the pancake bear interpretation. Now they are far more avian looking and a whole lot more creepy as well, but I think we're gonna ignore that retcon today and simply enjoy a tale of the Nicassar as they float happily and flatly through the galaxy. So, who are the Nicassar? What are they, and why are they so important to the Tau Empire? Well, their import is twofold. Firstly, they are important because they were the very first xeno-species that allowed themselves to be integrated into the Tau Empire. They did so willingly, and apparently quite happily, as the Nicassars themselves don't really give too much of a shit about their, national independence, so long as they're allowed to retain their independence of movement, or indeed to boost it yet further by cooperating with the Tau. You see, the Nicassar enjoy traveling more than anything else, and will do so at the expense of literally anything and everything. One wonders what kind of a homeworld they may once have had. Whether they all simply just abandon it, how they're now gaining their ships, etc. And a fair few interesting logistical questions, which their lore doesn't really explain. So, skip over most of those inconsistencies. And secondly, their value to the Tau Empire comes from their abilities as scouts, as travelers, and their reason for being able to provide these services. You see, the Nicassar, who are described as bear-like in appearance, with ivory quills that resemble hair or fur, and stubby clawed limbs, are a highly psychic species. This is obviously very, very interesting to the Tau, as their own psychic abilities are next to non-existent. They've barely even got souls, like most communists. And thus the Nicassar must be deeply fascinating, both from an alliance standpoint and from a research standpoint, but maybe we'll get into that a little bit more later. So, the Nicassar's psychic abilities are remarkable in that they appear to be practically universal, as there isn't any mention of non-psychic Nicassar. Granted, there isn't any mention either that they are all universally psychic, but considering that their psychic powers are powerful enough to propel their starships through the void, we've got to assume that either they have a large gathering of psykers, or they have extraordinarily powerful psykers, which they can produce reliably. Regardless, reliably is the key word here. The Nicassar are a stable mutation of highly powerful, powerful might be a misleading term, considering we don't know if they have any real offensive psychic abilities, or defensive ones for that matter, but at the very least powerful in that they can propel their ships using their minds, which I'd consider to be pretty damn impressive, personally. And the fact that they have the ability to produce psychics like this consistently. This is very unusual. Now, psychic species are not a complete unknown of in the galaxy by any stretch of the imagination. They are very rare, however, and organized psychic species are even rarer, and organized, stable psychic species that aren't unfathomably bloodthirsty, well, those are just about unheard of, particularly after the Imperium's campaign of conquest, of course. Bearing in mind that when the God Emperor led humanity into the stars to conquer them in the name of humanity, they were very aggressive towards any large-scale psychic species for very obvious reasons, relating to chaos, etc. And yet the Nicassar were either not advanced enough to be picked up at the time, or somehow skated under the radar. Now, the Nicassar themselves don't really use their psychic powers for much other than, again, propulsion, which they use to be of value to the Tau Empire by slowly, carefully, and meticulously scouting out systems and worlds and exploring the reaches of the galaxy. The Nicassar vessels are not themselves particularly fast, and so often the Tau will tow them to a new system or an area that they want explored, and then simply just leave them there, awaiting their report in however many years or decades it might take for the Nicassar to finish investigating everything. And they will investigate everything, driven by a seemingly boundless curiosity and happy only when traveling and exploring things. They can be left to their own devices to scout out vast areas of the galaxy without the Tau really needing to do anything about it beyond occasionally taxiing them about. And the reward for the Tau Empire is substantial. Enormous quantities of immeasurably valuable data. The locations of mineral deposits, of asteroids, of worlds capable of containing life, of worlds that do contain life, of the nature and identity of local species that might be uplifted into the Tau Empire. And even occasionally, the Nicassar will serve as sort of frontline diplomats that are often water-caste crew members aboard their vessels in case they run across anything interesting out there that they need to have a little bit of a chat to. And seeing as the Nicassar are one of the most successful integrations into the Tau Empire, they would be pretty damn good ambassadors to really, puff up the greater good for the Tau themselves. And again, crucially, all of this comes at precisely zero cost to the Tau. The Nicassar carry out their own travels, their own exploration, their own logging, their own messaging back to the Tau. They even bring their own boats, the Nicassar dhow. This is how the Nicassar discovered the Tau to begin with, as the dhows simply, gently and carefully drifted into their systems and started taking pictures, presumably for their vacation album. The Tau were obviously immediately interested because here was an obviously sophisticated alien species with the abilities to manufacture their own spaceships, and apparently also an extraordinarily happy-dappy and peaceful one, as the Nicassars are completely and utter garbage at all kinds of warfare. Now, being giant floating pancake bears, they are obviously not very good at ground warfare, and there is no indication that the Nicassar have ever bothered to engage in ground warfare of any real type or description. The Tau understand and appreciate this as well, and do not require for them to do so. Even their vessels, which you'd think be pretty goddamn important to the Nicassar, considering they are their only means of survival, were pathetically armed and armored. Clearly, this species of giant floating furries must have come from a uniquely peaceful part of the 41st millennium, and much like the Tau, are only alive today due to, a ridiculous case of unfathomably good fortune, really, that they weren't discovered by, orcs, Tyranids, Dark Eldar, Necrons, the Imperium, etc., etc. Very lucky for them. And lucky for the Tau as well, because the scouting is, what they're used for most often. But there is a second very good reason for why the Tau might want to keep them around. Their psychic abilities. Now again, the Nicassar psychic abilities are not that impressive, but seeing as the Tau have, none of their own, and since they know that most other species travel through space by using, the warp, which requires psychic abilities, the Nicassar would undoubtedly be very intriguing research and study subjects as well. Obviously, the Tau can't just outright dissect them, because it would go a little bit against the whole greater good thing. And for some reason, despite their passivity, I doubt the Nicassar themselves would be particularly appreciative of being sliced up willy-nilly for a Tau science experiment. And so the Tau are probably going to have to go about it a little bit more subtly than, knives and pins and stuff like that. But they would still, almost certainly and undoubtedly, carry out various monitoring exercises on the Nicassar, trying to figure out how their psychic powers work, trying to figure out how they are created, trying to figure out how they themselves utilize them effectively, so that the Tau can see if maybe there's a way for them to replicate what the Nicassar do, or if not replicated, then manipulated in a way that is similar to the other species, as the Tau unquestionably understand that the biggest problem to their ideas of bringing the entire galaxy under the gracious rule of the greater good is their inability to travel at anything even remotely approaching useful speeds. Without being able to dive deeply into the warp, the Tau will never become anything but a tiny provincial empire on the galactic scale. Furthermore, the Tau understand painfully well that their technology is simply not enough to overcome this problem, as the two known forms of in a way, warp travel for the Tau are the... the ether drive is the old one, and the something Horizon accelerator engine is the new one. This also has to do with the fact that Games Workshop doesn't read their own books, apparently, and thus have invented a drive that basically does the same thing twice, as neither the Ether drive or the Horizon drive is actually capable of bringing a Tau ship into the warp, and thus allowing it to cross vast distances quickly by ignoring the laws of physics and entering into this separate dimension. Instead, both of them, actually, no, not both of them, the first one, the Ether drive, again, I'm gonna get confused here because it's two things that do the same thing but have been invented at two separate times. It allows the ship to dip into the warp and then immediately it is repelled out of the warp. They do this by channeling so much energy that they manage to kind of sink like a rock into a extraordinarily elastic material, which that will then cause the universe to reject the rock or the ship, but in the time it does so, it will massively accelerate the ship, and for a fraction of a second, they will enter a realm not similar to, adjacent to the warp, perhaps. This allows them to skip across space at extraordinary speeds. Still, nothing compared to actual warp drives, but far faster than any real space engines. The second drive, as far as I'm aware, the Horizon drive, simply allows them to go really, really fast. Which introduces a whole heaping heck of a lot of issues, of course, seeing as simply going really, really fast would be fucking suicide in space. Because if you impact upon even a grain of sand, it will tear through your hull. But hey, details. Amusingly enough, Games Workshop actually came up with a better solution in the initial drive, because they could always hand-wave away all of the countless logistical issues with going really fast in space by saying, oh yeah, but they kind of enter the warp for a little bit, and therefore we don't need to worry about asteroids, space rocks, debris, anything like that, which would normally vaporize a vessel. Whereas their second iteration, well, was actually just a straight-up, worse one, where they apparently are able to travel at very close to light speed, which, again, would introduce the previous issues, unless they've somehow managed to create an alloy that would also, incidentally, pretty much make them immune to the vast majority of weapons fire. Again, this is why I have a problem with this. Faster than light travel only really works if you're using some sort of MacGuffin, essentially, to ignore the realities of traveling through a very vast area that has stuff in it. But anywho, to return to the point. The Tau now undoubtedly understand that their ability to travel truly quickly across the galaxy is limited to their ability to figure out some way to use psychic potential. Now, clearly the Nicassar are not going to be the solution in and of itself, for the simple reason that the Nicassar can't enter the warp either, at the very least not so far as we've been able to tell. But they're still psychers, and the Tau, understanding technology and then probably also biology to a far greater degree than the Imperium, must then also realize that there is something with these mystical pancake bears that allows them to do things that should be impossible. And they will absolutely have a connection to the warp, as all psychic powers are a connection to the warp in some way. They are probably going to have to look pretty hard, though, because the Nicassar also don't appear to be particularly psychically active, which is interesting considering, their psychic abilities. But if there was indeed an entire species of psyker bears out there, powerful enough to propel spaceships through space, even if at a languid pace, you'd think some of them would have, blown up by now and created a warp portal or something. It's beyond a miracle that these bastards actually made it into space in the first place, as by all rights one of them should have freaked out and turned into a warp portal by now, dragging their entire species into hell, quite literally. And hey, it's possible that this has happened, and it is possible that this is actually a concern. It is entirely possible that Nicassar vessels sometimes just disappear because they have been eaten by space demons. The Tau are also aware of this to a degree in that they've encountered demons. They've begun to figure out a loose understanding of demon kind and what makes them tick, and they will undoubtedly be very keen to avoid any further entanglements with demon kind. Meaning that the Tau's problem is, firstly, they gotta figure out how psychers work. Secondly, they've got to figure out how psychers work stably. And thirdly, they need to figure out the highly particular psychic mutation of the navigator genome. Because I also want to point out, of course, that navigators aren't merely just psychers either. They are a very, very, very specific mutation of a psyker. And once the Tau have somehow figured out all of that, they're then going to need to figure out how to replicate this knowledge and the navigator genome, in essence, effectively, repeatably, and stably, without sending their entire research station and the planet it's orbiting into Satan's abattoir. Yeah, it's probably gonna take a while. In the meantime, the Nicassar are going to do what they've always been doing, sailing through space, in extended clan groupings. Often the Nicassar ships, the dhows, are familial organizations, or clans, perhaps more correctly, where a extended family will live aboard it. Frequently, the whole family will not be active at once. Usually, large portions of them will be entering into some sort of hibernation, which is a natural ability of the Nicassar, because, well, they're pancake bears, so sleeping comes quite naturally to them, I do suppose, where they can while away the years, the decades, and perhaps even centuries, whilst only a skeleton crew actually operates the ship. Presumably the Nicassar have very extended lifetimes, otherwise they could have very active nurseries, I suppose. And considering the clan-like structure, yeah, probably, actually. On some occasions as well, the Nicassar will form fleets of sorts, though fleet is a misleading term, as that implies, naval power, conquering force, military might. Rather, the Nicassar fleets are collectives of dhows, collectives of clans or familial groupings linked together in some way, or perhaps even one large extended familial group that travel through space together, either due to bond want, or necessity, or because they like hanging out, I guess, or simple expediency at the time. I would also imagine that obviously these ships would need access to resources, unless they've somehow figured out replicator tech, I guess. Otherwise, they're going to need food, they're going to need water, access to energy, a way to fuel their bodies. They might need access to oxygen and ways to get rid of carbon dioxide. All of the things that living beings need to sustain themselves in space. A place that usually doesn't have a whole lot of these things. Meaning that they're going to have to find populatable worlds. They're going to have to find resources, minerals, water and food, etc., to generalize it somewhat, and then bring it aboard their ships. Presumably the extended hibernation will allow them to burn their resources very, very slowly, but even then, bears get fat before going into hibernation. They're going to need to gorge themselves so they can live off the fat reserves, or whatever they use, during extended periods of hibernation. This would in turn provide a very good reason for larger familial groups with several ships. Storage space, quite simply. And if indeed they can operate on a skeleton crew, whilst the vast majority of them are burning as little energy as possible, then there is absolutely strength in numbers. If only 10 out of, say, 200 crew members need to actually be alive, then you're not burning resources all that much faster, and you've doubled or tripled or quadrupled your actual transportation capacity. This also raises further questions as to how exactly they gain these resources because, well, the Nicassars seem virtually useless in anything approaching normal gravity. Even when they have audiences with the Tau, they inhibit specially made gravitic spheres, allowing them to not, presumably, be smushed by even basic gravity. As an extended lifetime in space, even if they have artificial gravity, even if they have ways to maintain bone density and muscle mass, the Nicassar are likely to be ridiculously fragile, and being exposed to anything even resembling standard gravity would probably kill them, or at the very least incapacitate or make them exceptionally uncomfortable. So how they mine asteroids or bring up water and food, etc.? Powerful psychic abilities. Or tech. The more I think about the pancake bears, the less real sense they make, but that's fine, because pancake bears are adorable. And with that, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon.